It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when Karen first noticed the truck across the street. At first glance, it was just another vehicle parked in the driveway of Steve, her middle-aged Republican neighbor. They hadn't been particularly close over the years, small talk at the mailbox, occasional nods when passing by, but there was something different this time. It wasn't the truck itself, a weathered Ford F-150 with a few dents and scratches here and there. It wasn't the size or even the faded paint job. What caught Karen's attention was the large, bold MAGA flag fluttering proudly from the truck's bed. She had seen it before, but today, it seemed to jump out at her, almost like it was challenging her. Karen had always prided herself on being a good neighbor. She kept to herself mostly, not one to stir trouble, but she wasn't one to shy away from speaking her mind either. And for some reason, that flag, flapping in the wind like a declaration, stirred something deep within her. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was agitated. The red and white banner felt like a personal affront, a symbol of everything she didn't stand for. She knew Steve had been vocal about his political views before, but this felt like a slap in the face. It was as if he was deliberately trying to make a statement, not just about politics, but about what he thought was acceptable in their quiet suburban neighborhood. At first, she tried to ignore it. She focused on her work, took care of the household chores, but every time she looked out the window, there it was. That flag. It became a fixture of her daily life, constantly in her peripheral vision. When Karen was getting her mail, when she was watering her plants in the front yard, it loomed there. She couldn't escape it, and the more she saw it, the more her frustration grew. It wasn't just about the flag, it was what it represented. The divide. The anger. The division that seemed to be growing in their community and in the country. She had heard the whispers around the neighborhood, half the people didn't seem to mind, or even agreed with it, while others were upset but kept their opinions to themselves. Karen wasn't that kind of person. She was a fighter, someone who spoke out when things didn't sit right. But it wasn't until one fateful evening that she reached her breaking point. She had been sitting in her living room, half watching the news and half thinking about the situation, when Steve pulled into his driveway. The flag waved proudly in the evening breeze, and it was as if the sight of it stoked an old fire she hadn't known was still burning. Her blood began to boil. She found herself clenching her fists, trying to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Why should he get to display something that represented so much hate, so much division? Why should she have to look at it every day? She didn't care about Steve's right to express himself, but to her, this wasn't just a flag, it was a statement that she felt personally attacked by. The world had become increasingly polarized, and it felt as though people like Steve were turning a blind eye to the pain and struggle so many others faced. Her frustration had reached a fever pitch, and as much as she tried to calm herself, she knew deep down that something had to be done. The thought came to her like a lightning bolt: get the truck towed. It was a rash decision, impulsive even, but in that moment, it felt like the only solution. Karen knew that Steve would get the message. He'd understand what she meant, even if no one else did. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe it was extreme. But the flag, flapping in the wind every day, felt like an unbearable reminder of everything that had gone wrong. She spent the next hour pacing in her living room, the idea growing louder in her mind. Finally, she made the call. She contacted the tow company, explained the situation, just enough to get them on board, though she knew it was a thin justification. There was no turning back now. Karen hung up the phone, heart racing. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping in, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. The tension she'd carried for weeks was finally going to be released. She had control over the situation. But as she stood by the window, waiting for the tow truck to arrive, a small part of her wondered if she was making a mistake. Maybe she should have just let it go, let the flag fade into the background of their daily lives. But no. This was bigger than just a flag. It was about standing up for what she believed in. The flag was a symbol of everything that was wrong, and Karen couldn't bear the idea of letting it go unchallenged. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of anticipation and regret. Karen couldn't stop replaying the decision over and over in her head, trying to convince herself that it was the right choice. She kept telling herself that she was standing up for something bigger than herself, for the values she believed in. But each time she looked out the window and saw Steve's truck parked in the driveway, her stomach twisted. The flag, still waving proudly, seemed to mock her decision, its boldness underscoring the uncertainty in her own mind. It was as if the universe was daring her to act. One evening, after dinner, she sat down with her husband, Greg. They'd been married for years, and although their relationship had always been built on trust and respect, Karen felt an unfamiliar tension growing between them. She could see the concern in his eyes whenever the topic of Steve's flag came up. Greg, a man of few words but deep conviction, had always been someone who avoided conflict. He didn't want to rock the boat, didn't want to make waves. He saw things differently than Karen, often opting for diplomacy rather than confrontation. "Are you sure about this, Karen?" Greg asked, his voice soft but laced with a hint of concern. "I get it, the flag bugs you, but calling a tow truck over it? Isn't that a bit much?" Karen had expected the question, but hearing it out loud, from him, hit her harder than she'd imagined. She could feel the frustration bubbling inside her. Of course, he didn't understand. He didn't feel the same way. Greg wasn't as emotionally invested in the neighborhood politics as she was. He wasn't the one staring at that flag every day, wondering how a symbol of division had come to dominate their once peaceful block. "It's not just the flag, Greg," Karen snapped, a little more sharply than she intended. "It's what it represents. The hatred, the anger, it's all part of this mess we're living in. This country's falling apart, and that flag is a reminder of it every single day." Greg didn't respond right away. He leaned back in his chair, as if weighing her words carefully, before he finally spoke. "I understand that it bothers you, Karen. But do you really think that towing his truck is going to solve anything? It's just going to escalate the situation. You've got to think about the consequences." But Karen wasn't listening anymore. The idea had taken root in her mind, and nothing Greg said seemed to shake her resolve. She wasn't just angry at the flag, she was angry at the state of the world, at everything that felt out of control. Towing Steve's truck would be her way of taking back some power, of making a stand. And, in that moment, it felt like the right thing to do. The following morning, Karen's decision came to fruition. She watched from her window as the tow truck pulled up to Steve's driveway. It was a surreal moment. The weight of what she was about to do seemed to hang in the air, but it didn't stop her from walking outside, feeling a rush of exhilaration mixed with anxiety. The tow truck driver, a burly man in a faded baseball cap, didn't ask any questions. He had been given the order, and he was there to do his job. Karen stood on her front porch, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Steve's truck. The tow truck driver worked quickly, expertly lifting the truck off the ground. It wasn't long before Steve's vehicle was hauled away, leaving the driveway empty. As the tow truck pulled off, Karen stood there, watching it disappear down the street, a sense of triumph filling her chest. It was over. Steve's truck, his symbol of defiance, was gone. But the relief didn't last. No sooner had the tow truck turned the corner than Karen began to feel a cold pit in her stomach. What had she done? Her pulse raced as the initial wave of adrenaline started to fade. There was no going back now. As she turned to head back inside, she caught sight of Steve pulling into his driveway. He was alone, his face hard and unreadable as he stopped his car and stared at the empty spot where his truck had been just minutes before. The silence of the moment was deafening. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Steve's reaction. He slowly got out of his car and walked over to where his truck had been, looking around as if trying to make sense of what had happened. When he realized it was gone, his expression darkened. Karen's phone rang, and she jumped, startled by the sudden noise. She looked down at the screen, her stomach turning when she saw Steve's name flash across it. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the answer button, but then she took a deep breath and pressed it. "What the hell, Karen?" Steve's voice was low, but there was no mistaking the anger in it. "Where's my truck? What did you do?" She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, the guilt starting to creep in, but she forced herself to remain steady. I had it towed," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's been bothering me for weeks, and I couldn't take it anymore. The flag, the whole thing, it's just too much." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Karen could almost hear the rage simmering on the other side, but Steve said nothing for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke, his voice colder than before. "You think that's going to solve anything? You think taking my truck is going to change my mind?" he asked, his words biting. "You've made a mistake, Karen. A big one." The conversation ended abruptly, with Steve hanging up without so much as a goodbye. Karen stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, staring at the empty space where Steve's truck had been. Her stomach twisted as the full weight of what she'd done sank in. She had acted impulsively, driven by her anger and frustration, but now it felt like she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And deep down, she knew that the battle she thought she was winning was only just beginning. In the quiet that followed, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this would change. The next few days were a blur for Karen, each one heavier than the last. The initial sense of relief she had felt when the tow truck had hauled Steve's truck away began to wear off quickly. She had expected some sort of vindication, a feeling of righteousness that would affirm her decision, but instead, she found herself drowning in anxiety. The moment Steve had hung up the phone, it felt like a door had slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the consequences of her actions. As she went about her daily routine, the weight of the situation pressed down on her more and more. Every time she stepped outside, it felt like the eyes of the neighborhood were on her, judging her, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was palpable. Karen could sense the shift in the neighborhood, people were talking. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in a small suburban town. Some neighbors, ones who had always kept to themselves, started avoiding her altogether. Others whispered behind closed doors, offering their opinions on what had transpired. The mix of support and condemnation was confusing, and for the first time in years, Karen felt isolated. Her phone buzzed incessantly with texts and messages from family and friends, each one more perplexing than the last. Some were angry, some were confused, and some were concerned. Her best friend, Laura, had sent a long message with a single question: "Did you really think this through, Karen?" At first, Karen ignored it, but as the day wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that Laura was right. She had acted in the heat of the moment, without considering the fallout. What had she done? What had she really accomplished? In her mind, she had taken a stand. The flag, the symbol of everything she opposed, was gone. But what did that actually mean? Had she truly changed anything, or had she just ignited a fire that she wasn't ready to put out? As the days passed, the inevitable confrontation finally came. Steve wasn't someone to let something like this go, and Karen had known, deep down, that the storm was only just beginning. She had hoped, foolishly, that maybe he would let it slide. That perhaps he'd chalk it up to her being an overzealous neighbor and let the matter fade. But Steve wasn't that kind of man. He was driven by a deep sense of pride, and in that moment, it became clear to Karen that her actions had touched a nerve much deeper than she realized. It was a Saturday afternoon when Steve showed up at her door. The weather was unusually hot for the time of year, and Karen had been sitting on the porch, scrolling through her phone, trying to distract herself from the growing sense of dread in her chest. The moment she saw Steve standing at the edge of her driveway, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief, she knew things had just gone from bad to worse. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't move toward him. The porch felt like a safe distance, a boundary she didn't want to cross. Steve's eyes were fixed on her with an intensity she had never seen before. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and imposing, but his posture was stiff with restraint. It was clear he was holding something back, probably a lot of things. "Karen," he said, his voice quiet but sharp, "you've really done it now." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. She had expected anger, maybe even a little bit of frustration, but there was something about the way Steve spoke that made her realize just how serious this had become. Everything. "I had no choice, Steve," she finally said, the words coming out more defensively than she intended. "You know what that flag represents. It's not just a piece of fabric, it's a symbol of everything that's wrong with this country." Steve's eyes narrowed, and Karen could see the tension in his jaw, the veins in his neck. But instead of snapping back, he took a deep breath and spoke again, this time with more control. "Karen, I get that you don't like the flag, that it offends you. But what you did, that's not how you handle things. You don't just take someone's property because you disagree with them. You think I'm the problem, but you're just as guilty. You've crossed a line, and now I have to deal with the fallout." Karen's mind raced. She had expected Steve to lash out, to accuse her of being a radical, but he wasn't yelling. He wasn't throwing insults. He was speaking calmly, but the words hit harder because of it. She tried to defend herself, but her words seemed weak and hollow in the face of his resolve. She had made a decision, but now, she realized, it wasn't just Steve's truck that was at stake, it was everything. "I didn't know what else to do," Karen said, her voice trembling now. "I was just so angry, Steve. I couldn't look at that flag anymore. I thought," she stopped herself, her mind suddenly catching up with her emotions. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Steve shook his head slowly, his expression softening, but only just. "It's not about right or wrong, Karen. It's about respect. You may not agree with me, but I've lived here for years. I've done nothing but be a good neighbor. And you've taken something from me. And that's not something I can just ignore." There was a long silence between them. Karen wanted to argue, to justify her actions, but she could feel the weight of his words sinking in. She had acted without thinking about the bigger picture. She had been so focused on what the flag represented to her that she hadn't considered what it might mean to Steve, to the people who lived in this neighborhood, and to the community as a whole. What had she really accomplished? What had she really changed? Steve stood there for a moment longer, watching her, before finally turning and walking away. Karen stood frozen in place, staring after him as he made his way back to his house. She couldn't help but feel a sharp pang of regret. It was one thing to act on her emotions, but it was another to realize that she had just opened a door that she couldn't close. The neighborhood was divided now. Steve wasn't the only one who would be affected by what had happened. And Karen knew that things would never be the same again. As the evening settled in, Karen found herself standing in the same spot, staring out at Steve's empty driveway, feeling an odd sense of emptiness. The truck was gone, but so was something else, a part of the peace she had once taken for granted. And as much as she tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at stake now. The following week passed in an uneasy silence. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that the neighborhood had shifted, like the quiet calm before a storm. Everywhere she went, she saw the ripple effects of what had transpired. The neighbors who had once smiled and waved at her now kept their distance, avoiding eye contact whenever they crossed paths. The subtle glances, the hushed conversations, and the uncomfortable silences, it all added up to a sense that she had become an outsider in her own community. The weight of the decision she had made seemed to press in on her from all sides. Karen had been so sure of herself when she had called the tow truck, so convinced that she was doing the right thing. But now, with the distance of time and the quiet aftermath, doubt was beginning to creep in. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation with Steve over and over in her mind. She couldn't help but wonder how it might have gone differently if she had stopped and thought before acting. If she had taken a moment to consider the consequences, perhaps things wouldn't have escalated so quickly. She had always been a person of conviction, driven by the need to take action when she saw injustice, but she had never thought that standing up for what she believed in could create such a deep rift in her community. Was it worth it? One afternoon, Karen sat on her porch, absently sipping her iced tea, when she saw the first signs that things were starting to unravel. A group of neighbors had gathered outside Steve's house, talking in low voices, their faces hard with concern. Karen couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but it didn't take much to realize that they were talking about her. She had been the talk of the block for days now, and she could feel the weight of it settling on her shoulders. The situation was getting out of hand, and Karen knew it. She had hoped that it would blow over, that people would eventually forget about the tow and move on. But she had underestimated how deeply this event had affected everyone. Steve's truck wasn't just a vehicle, it had become a symbol. And in trying to remove that symbol, Karen had unwittingly ignited a firestorm of division and animosity. The first message came in a text from Laura. "Have you heard? Steve's thinking about taking you to court." Karen read the words over and over, the reality sinking in with every passing second. She had known it was a possibility, but hearing it from someone she trusted made it feel all the more real. The idea of a lawsuit was daunting. It wasn't just about the truck anymore, it was about legal consequences, public perception, and her place in a community that was no longer as familiar as it once had been. But even as fear gripped her, Karen couldn't help but feel a surge of defiance. She had acted out of conviction, and even if the consequences were harsh, she wasn't about to back down. The thought of apologizing, of admitting that she had been wrong, felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. She had done what she thought was right. She had fought against something that, to her, represented division and hatred. If that meant facing the consequences, then so be it. But it wasn't just Steve who was angry. As the week wore on, Karen began to notice a shift in the attitudes of other neighbors. A few had openly confronted her, asking her why she had done what she did. Some had supported her initial actions, citing their own dissatisfaction with the political climate, but most were confused or upset. "You can't just take matters into your own hands like that," one neighbor, Janice, had said during a brief conversation in the front yard. "I get that you're upset, but it's not your place to do something like that." Karen had tried to explain herself, to rationalize her actions. She told them about how the flag made her feel, how it symbolized a much deeper issue of division that had seeped into every corner of their lives. But the more she tried to justify herself, the more she realized that her explanation wasn't making the impact she had hoped for. She hadn't just taken a flag down, she had taken something much bigger away from people, their autonomy. Steve had every right to display his beliefs, no matter how different they were from hers. And by removing that right, by making a decision without considering the broader implications, Karen had crossed a line. It wasn't long before Steve's retaliation came. A letter arrived in Karen's mailbox one chilly morning, a formal notice from Steve's attorney, threatening legal action for the towing of his property. The letter was crisp and professional, outlining the details of the incident and demanding compensation for the unlawful removal of his vehicle. Karen felt her blood run cold as she read through the letter. It wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a stark reminder that her actions had consequences. She had taken a stand, yes, but now she was facing the fallout. She showed the letter to Greg, who read it with a growing sense of concern. Karen could see the stress lines deepening on his face. He had never been a fan of confrontation, and the reality of their situation seemed to hit him harder than it had hit her. "Karen, this is serious. I know you felt justified, but this could get ugly. We need to think about what's next." Karen felt a tightness in her chest. She had never wanted things to escalate this far. She had hoped that, in time, the tensions would settle, that Steve would let it go, that the neighborhood would return to some semblance of normal. But now, everything was unraveling. The neighborhood that had once felt like a community, a place where everyone respected each other's differences, now felt alien. Even her friends were growing distant, unsure of how to navigate the situation. Despite the mounting pressure, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her convictions. Yes, the consequences were greater than she had anticipated, but she had taken a stand. She had stood up for what she believed was right, even if it meant facing the wrath of an entire neighborhood. She had been impulsive, yes, but she had done it because she thought it was the right thing to do. But with every passing day, Karen could see that the world she had once known was slipping further and further away. The divide between her and Steve, between her and the neighbors, wasn't just political, it was personal. The lines had been drawn, and she was on one side, with no clear way of crossing back. It was as if the very foundation of their community had cracked, and there was no telling what would happen next. All she could do now was brace for the storm that was coming, and try to figure out where she fit in a world that had grown far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The storm Karen had been bracing for arrived faster than she had anticipated. It wasn't the kind of storm that came with thunder or lightning, but the kind that crept up quietly, slowly, until it felt like the weight of the world was bearing down on her. The lawsuit from Steve was just the beginning. Over the next few days, it seemed like every conversation she had with neighbors, family, and friends revolved around the incident. People were angry. People were confused. And worse, people were taking sides. The neighborhood was becoming divided in ways Karen had never imagined, and the emotional toll was far heavier than she had ever expected. Karen spent her days feeling the sting of isolation. She tried to go about her normal routine, but every time she stepped outside, she felt the eyes of the world on her. Her neighbors, once friendly faces, now crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. At the grocery store, she overheard whispered conversations about her and Steve, with people passing judgment on her decision to have his truck towed. Some called her brave, some called her reckless. But for Karen, none of the labels mattered. It was the quiet discomfort that stung the most, the way people treated her like she was no longer part of the community. It wasn't just her neighbors. Her own family had become distant. Karen's mother had been supportive at first, but now, after seeing the toll it was taking on Karen, she had begun to question her actions. "I just don't want you to make things worse, Karen," her mother had said one evening over the phone. "You've made your point, but at what cost? Is it really worth it?" Her mother's words echoed in her mind as Karen sat in her living room, staring at the letter Steve had sent from his lawyer. The contents were simple, but they carried a weight of their own. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. Steve was asking for damages, for the cost of the towing, and for a public apology. But it wasn't the money that bothered Karen, it was the humiliation, the idea that she had to admit that she had done something wrong. The days dragged on, and Karen began to feel like she was suffocating under the weight of the situation. She had no choice but to face Steve in court. There was no way around it now. The legal battle loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon, and every day that passed only seemed to add to the tension. Her initial sense of rightness had faded, replaced by a gnawing feeling of uncertainty. Had she been too hasty? Had she miscalculated the consequences? There were moments when she wished she could turn back time, make a different choice, but she knew that wasn't possible. One night, after weeks of silence, Karen received a surprise visitor. It was Steve. He stood at her door, not in anger, but in quiet resolve. His face was tired, his eyes lacking the usual fire, and for a moment, Karen didn't know what to expect. She opened the door cautiously, bracing herself for another confrontation. But instead, Steve simply stepped inside, and they both stood there, unsure of what to say. "I didn't come here to fight," Steve said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "I'm not going to apologize for what I did, Karen. But I'm not here to make things worse either." Karen stood silently, waiting for him to continue, wondering where this was going. After a long pause, Steve sighed. "I don't agree with what you did, and I still think it was wrong. But I also know that things have gotten out of hand. This whole thing, it's bigger than either of us, and it's hurting the community. I'm tired of fighting." The words hit Karen harder than she had expected. For the first time, she saw Steve as a person, not just the man whose truck she had towed. His eyes were weary, and she could see the toll this was taking on him, too. "What do you want from me, Steve?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want this to end," Steve said quietly. "I don't want to go to court. I don't want the neighborhood to be torn apart over a flag. I want my truck back. But more than that, I want us to figure out how to fix this." Karen felt a wave of relief and confusion wash over her. She had been expecting the worst, and yet here was Steve, not with demands for more, but with a willingness to make amends. It was the last thing she had anticipated. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, unsure of what the next step even was. Steve paused, as if weighing the words. "Maybe we start by talking. Not just you and me. But everyone. We've all been so caught up in our differences, but maybe we've lost sight of what really matters, being a community. You and I, we've both made mistakes. But if we want things to get better, we've got to meet somewhere in the middle. Not everyone is going to agree, but we have to stop letting this thing tear us apart." Karen could hardly believe what she was hearing. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. For the first time in weeks, she felt like there was a chance for something positive to come from this. It wasn't about winning anymore, it was about finding a way forward, even if it meant swallowing her pride. Over the next few weeks, Karen and Steve worked together to organize a neighborhood meeting. The goal wasn't to settle the legal dispute or to hash out their differences about the flag, but to open up a dialogue. People came, some reluctantly, others eager to air their grievances. Karen was surprised by the number of neighbors who expressed their frustration with the division, with the bitterness that had taken root in the community. They were tired of the tension, tired of the anger. Some even admitted that they had been too quick to judge her, just as she had been too quick to judge them. The conversation was messy and uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. In the end, no one walked away with all their issues resolved, but something changed that day. The neighborhood began to heal, slowly but surely. The division didn't disappear overnight, but the lines of hostility softened. People started talking again, not just about politics or their personal grievances, but about the things that connected them. And though Karen still felt the weight of what she had done, she also felt something else, a sense of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bridge the gap between opposing views. But as time passed, Karen realized that the biggest change had come within herself. She had learned that acting out of conviction without considering the broader consequences could have unexpected and far-reaching impacts. She had learned that sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to admit that your actions, no matter how justified they seem, can harm others in ways you never intended. And, perhaps most importantly, she had learned that in a divided world, the true power wasn't in being right, it was in finding common ground. In the end, the community didn't just recover, it became stronger. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and not everyone agreed, but there was a deeper sense of connection that hadn't been there before. And as for Karen, she knew that her life, and the neighborhood, would never be the same again. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally moving forward. Her own family had started to come around, too. Her mother, after seeing the changes in Karen, began to understand that there was more to the situation than she had initially realized. One Sunday afternoon, Karen and her mother sat in the garden, having tea, the conversation light and easy. "I have to admit, Karen, I didn't think this would end well. But maybe I underestimated you," her mother said, a faint smile on her face. Karen laughed softly, a little surprised at the compliment. "I didn't think it would end well either. But I guess sometimes we need to mess things up a little to figure out how to make them better." She paused, then added, "I didn't just learn from Steve. I learned a lot from everyone, my neighbors, even the ones I thought were too set in their ways. They showed me that no one's perspective is ever as simple as it seems." Her mother nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "I'm proud of you for trying to make things right," she said quietly. "That's not always an easy thing to do." Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear that, how much she had needed the validation not just from her family but from herself. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also been one of the most meaningful things she had ever experienced. She had learned that real strength wasn't in making an impression or forcing her beliefs on others, it was in understanding, in empathy, in the willingness to change. Her relationship with the rest of the neighborhood continued to improve, though Karen knew it would take time to fully rebuild the trust that had been fractured. Some residents, particularly those who had been vocal in their opposition to her actions, were still wary. But many others, especially those who had been on the sidelines, began to approach her again, initiating conversations and offering their own perspectives. Karen didn't take it for granted. She knew that true healing took time and patience, and that the effects of one impulsive decision could last longer than anyone realized. The neighborhood eventually came together for a block party, something they hadn't done in years. The event was a chance for everyone to put aside their differences and simply enjoy the company of those they lived alongside. Karen attended, her heart both heavy and hopeful. It was at the party that she had an unexpected conversation with Laura, one of her old friends who had distanced herself in the wake of the conflict. "I've been thinking about what you said," Laura told her as they stood near the grill, watching kids run around with balloons. "And I think I understand now. You weren't just standing up for yourself, you were standing up for what you thought was right. I don't agree with everything you did, but I respect your conviction. That's hard to come by these days." Karen smiled, feeling a sense of relief. "Thank you, Laura. That means more than you know." She paused, then added, "Maybe we all need to be a little braver about standing up for what we believe in, but also be willing to listen when we're called out." Laura nodded, her expression softening. "You know, I think you're right." The conversation marked the final piece of the puzzle that had been Karen's journey, a realization that the process of transformation wasn't just about changing others' views, but about changing herself. The lessons she had learned would stick with her for the rest of her life. She knew that she would never be the same person she had been before this event. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The neighborhood would always be a little different now, but it had been made stronger in the end. Not because everyone agreed, but because they had learned to live with their differences and find ways to coexist, to build bridges instead of walls. Karen had made a mistake, but through that mistake, she had helped bring about something far more meaningful than a simple resolution. She had helped forge a path toward healing, understanding, and most of all, growth. In the end, Karen's actions had not just changed the course of one moment or one conflict. They had changed her entire worldview. And though she had no way of knowing what the future held, one thing was certain: she would face it with a renewed sense of compassion, an openness to change, and a deeper understanding of the power of connection. And as for the neighborhood, it had found its way back to something real, something human, together, despite everything.